Hi, welcome to Sewing with Sandy. Today we're going to talk about Vogue 2037. Now I made both pieces, both top pieces on this pattern. I made this top. I didn't make it a crop top and I didn't make it out of a woven because I didn't want to put a zipper in it. I made it a full length. It goes to just the top of the waistband, and I made it out of this really nice stretch Lurex from Mood. How cute is that, right? Adorable. It's nice because it has wide straps, and I have a video on how to transform the pattern from a woven to a knit, and I'll put it down there when it's uploaded. I'll make sure I add it to the bottom. And then I made this blouse, which is in this semi-sheer fabric from Mood, and I just love this cat fabric. I think it's absolutely stunning. I made a couple of changes to the pattern. I didn't put buttons all the way down. It calls for buttons all the way down the front. This fabric is super light and I would never button it all the way up. So I just put one button at the top and then some coordinating buttons that I had in my stash for the cuffs. Also, you have to be really, really careful about the band on this, but in order to get this beautiful drape on the band, and you'll see it as we go along, you really need to pay attention to putting the band on, making sure you have the right size. There is a lot of hand stitching in this. I hand stitched this whole band on because if this opens up as you're walking, you don't want to see like really disgusting seam work back here. So I hand stitched everything. It's a Vogue pattern. It has some work, it has some details, but we're gonna go through every single one of them and you can make it perfect. So let's get started. First step with this Vogue pattern is to interface all of your pieces, and there's a lot of them that need to be interfaced because it's a blouse technically, and since this fabric is super soft and drapey, I want to make sure that I interfaced everything. I used a black tricot interfacing, which is hard to find, but when you need it, it's perfect. It's great to have, so you can see what a difference it makes. So this one's interfaced and the black really is nice with this black fabric, so you can see the difference in giving it some body, so that's really important. The next thing we want to do is we want to stay stitch the neck edge on the back on piece 2, and that is just running a stitch on each piece independent of each other to keep this from stretching. So you run it inside the seam line. In this pattern, the seam allowance is 5/8 of an inch, so you want to run this at 3/8, and it's just a row of stitching to keep this from stretching out as you're working with it. The next thing we're going to do, and this is sheer. This sheer does not like the overlocker, and it can be ravelly after you wash it once or twice. So we have to figure out a way. I do, because mine's sheer, but if you make it out of a brocade or something that you can't put in the overlocker, you need to think about how you're going to finish the seam. So we're going to stitch the center back up to this dot here because this is the kick pleat, so that we're going to finish that. That's our first step. So we're going to sew this up. So I already love this. This fabric is just to die for with these kitties. I mean, that is so cute. So I sewed up the center back seam, and because I use glass head pins, I can stick them right into my ironing board and iron over them. So in order to fold this back piece, I initially folded it on the line that's on the pattern, and then opened it up and pinned this section at 1/4 of an inch and steamed it over my pins. And then I can go back and I have this really nice finished seam. And then I'm gonna sew it from this side so I can see what I'm doing, and that way I don't need to baste it, so I can see where I'm going and get a nice even stitch all the way around my back vent. So that was pretty quick, right? That vent is done. Looks great. And then we're going to take piece 1, or pieces, the 1 pieces, and we're going to stay stitch each one of those around the neckline independently, just like we did with the back pieces. I have 2 here, I promise. There we go. So we're just going to stay stitch this neckline again, right near the inside the seam allowance, just to keep it from stretching out, because you don't, the last thing you want to do is go to put your collar on and have this all stretched out, and then your collar is waffly. That is not fun. After we do the stay stitching, we're going to sew the front and the back at the shoulder seams and the side seams. So when we do that, we're going to lay the right side of our back. I like to lay my pieces out in front of me. I still, after so many years of sewing, lay them out so I don't get them mixed up. I don't want to sew the incorrect side on, right? So this is how it's going to look. This is my arm, this is my shoulder seam, my center front. Same on this side, all right? So I'm going to sew this shoulder seam up here and these long side seams on either side. All right, here we come to a critical part in our pattern. We're going to put the bands on, and this can be super tricky. So there's a couple of things that you want to take your time and make sure you do them correctly. The first thing, piece 3, which is this big long piece of band and facing. Make sure that you pull out the size that you cut for the rest of the garment. There's a bunch of these in your tissue. This is a size 16. I cut a size 16 shirt, but if you cut a 14, make sure you use the 14 band and not the 16 band. That's important. Secondly, the back band, you know, they're all, the pattern piece is multi-sized, but it's curved. It's flat here at this end. This is the center back. It says center back in there. And then this side, you can see, has an uptick to it. The curve goes up. So those are important considerations when you are moving forward with your pieces. So I laid my back piece on and put a pin in the center back, so I know that that's my center back piece, because I don't want to sew this end to my long facing. That's not going to help me any. This has got a little curve to it. So I'm going to pin this and my long facing piece together here at the bottom. And we're going to put these right sides together. So they're going to get pinned together here to make one continuous piece of facing. I'm going to pin them and stitch them together. Then on the inside curve, because we have a concave and a convex curve going together. So on the inside curve, the part that this is the other side. So this is my center back, this is my side seam, and I have this really weird curve thing going on because of the way the jacket is made. This inside curve, you want to run a bead of stitching about a 1/2 inch. You don't want to have to unpick it because you're going to see this. This is part of the front of the garment, right? This is your button tab. So you want to stitch about a 1/2 inch. That'll give you the opportunity to clip it without your fabric fraying while you pin it to your top. So we're going to do that now. Okay, so here is my center back, and you're sewing the inside curve to this outside curve, right? So I'm going to lay it down the way, just as I always do this, I lay it down the way it's going to look when it's finished. So I know that the shorter curve is getting attached to the bottom of my blouse, because this you're going to see this. We're going to attach the other pieces and wrap them around for facing to finish it off. So a couple of things that we want to do. We want to match up this side seam, and you don't see it so much with this cat fabric, but if you had a solid color or something, this side seam would be super obvious. So we want to match that up. And then this pin that I put for my center back, I want to match that up with my finished center back seam. So it hangs over a little bit, because we're going to add the other facing to it and turn it around. So now you can see it's like a sleeve. We have a convex and a concave seam that we're sewing together. So it takes time. You just have to take your time and pin it. And you want the blouse down towards the feed dogs. That will help pick up any of the extra ease that needs to go in, because these are concave and convex seams. But you can see that pins together beautifully. And you know, this is one of those seams that, like, if you're worried, baste it. you know, go ahead and baste it. Now I happen to have a little extra here. I'm just gonna let my end pin out. I might have overdone it a little here on the end. There we go. Oh, I just wanna make sure that I have a 5/8 inch seam on the end here so I can finish the garment. Then I'm gonna pin this side all the way around and up to the very front neckline of my piece. So that's gonna take some work, and I'm just gonna go slow. You know, you want these seams, they're a little curvy, and that's what gives this garment its interesting shape. So you take your time pinning it. If you pin it, you'll have a much better go at it than if you just stick it in the machine and go for it. So on something like this where there's a lot of pins, and I'm using the interfaced piece, this is the piece that's going to be forward. It's going to give the blouse a little bit of structure. One of the things that I did when I cut piece 3, this super long piece, so this is my side seam, I knew that. I cut this end seam a little longer. So I gave myself a couple of inches, and then that way I have some leeway and I can just cut it off even with the neckline. Just instead of trying to, you know, this fabric is really slippery. And if either the blouse or the facing is a little bit short or a little bit long because the tissue slipped or whatever, this gives you some grace to have some leeway. So you can see my interfacing is just about the right size, but I have this little extra tail here, which after I sew it, I'll cut it off. So we're gonna go ahead and take this to the machine. I'll put this side in and the other side, and we'll come back and finish up this facing. All right, you sew this band on and you have this rumply thing that looks like this when you're finished. See how you have all this lifting up here, which is right because we have that convex and concave seam. So the first thing you want to do is check and make sure you don't have any pleats in there, and after that you want to take this to the iron and press this seam into the fabric. But you don't want to press the whole facing part, right? You can see let me just put this underneath here. You can see my facing here, right? You don't want to press these wrinkles into the facing. So you want to be careful just to press the seam. That's really the most important thing. Then you're going to trim away a good chunk of this seam. So I'm trimming it down to where I made that row of 1/2 inch stitching, and you can make it nice and neat, right? And you have this very little tiny seam in there. After you've done that, you're gonna go through and you're going to clip. And I clipped you clip to the seam, but not through the seam, the actual seam. And I clipped about every inch. If you run into a problem where it just won't lay flat, then clip every 1/2 inch if you have to. So you can see on this side, I have clipped into all those pieces. See, they're about every inch. And that helps my band lay flat. See how nice and flat that is? So after I clipped it, I went back and I pressed the seam towards the band. And then I went around the front and pressed and made sure that this was all flat and beautiful. You can see here I have a little ridge. I need to put another clip in there. It's missing a clip, and that will just help this whole thing. Or my clips aren't all the way to the seam allowance. They're not far enough, they're not deep enough. And those clips just take care of that right away. So that's it. So you wanna make sure this is all nice and smooth. It's well pressed, it's lying flat. You don't want any bumps or rumples. And if you look at this side, this piece hasn't been pressed or clipped yet. See how that's rolling? It's not lying flat. There's a bump in there. You don't want any of that. Before you sew before you even begin to sew, think about sewing your facing on, this needs to be perfectly flat, okay? So we're gonna sew our facing pieces together in the same fashion that we sewed this banding together. We're gonna sew them at the seam down here for the back, making sure that we have the back piece together. We're gonna make one big long strip for each side, and then we'll put them together. On the inside of the curve, we're going to stitch, just like we did with the other one, about 1/2 inch from the raw edge. That's to help you fold this once we have to finish the inside of the facing by hand stitching it. We'll trim this and clip it as I'm attaching it to my banding and hand sewing it. That way I know exactly what I'm getting and I can keep them even. But right now what I want to do is I want to pin this onto the top of my banding. So I'm pinning the facing to the banding, and I always start at the seams because I can match them up. In this case, I'm butting them together because I want to have a really nice seam. And I put one pin on each side of the seam allowance because I have one seam allowance going to the left and one seam allowance going to the right. And then I'm just going to walk this all the way around and pin it. Take the time to do this because if this is crooked or wrinkly or rumply, you're gonna see it and it's not gonna be pretty. I mean, we're making a Vogue pattern. Your expectation going into making this pattern should be that it's going to take some time and some effort. So you can see we have these two pieces off the edge of our finished back vent, and we're gonna sew those together eventually. So I'm gonna pin this all the way around and stitch it and trim it and then press it flat. Key, pressing it flat, right? If it's not pressed flat, you're not gonna get a really nice finish. If you have rumples or bumps, you need to get rid of them because this is the part of the dress that's hanging, or the jacket, it's hanging, and you're going to see it. So now I've trimmed this seam. I'm gonna go around and clip it, and I clip it to make sure that it, you know, just like we did the other one, every inch or so, particularly on the concave and the convex. And then I'm going to press the facing and the seam allowance in the same direction and understitch. And when I understitch, I run a stitch just along this edge. So I want to make sure that this is flat, right, and pressed really well, and then run that stitch along that edge, and it catches the facing and the seam allowance together. So before I do that, I want to make sure that it's clipped and pressed and it's lying nice and flat, and then I'm going to go take care of the understitching. So before you understitch, you want to take care of this corner. So this is the back vent that we cut and hemmed, and you want to fold over on the facing part, the raw edge. I trimmed mine a little, and then stitch it so it's even with this back edge here. And then we're going to fold in one side, and please, to get a good corner, stitch off the edge. Don't pivot there, stitch off both sides. So fold one corner, fold the other corner, and you can see we have this really nice point. And we're just gonna grab it between our thumb and our forefinger and turn it around. And every time you get an absolutely beautiful point. I mean, that point isn't even pressed yet. That looks gorgeous, right? Then we're gonna understitch it. So we're going to stitch the seam allowance to the facing. This has nothing to do with the banding. This is all about the facing. And we're gonna stitch it, I know it's hard to see with the black, as close as possible to that seam edge there. Now, what that does is it allows us to turn the hem, or the facing, if you will, perfectly. This is my sleeve board, so I'm just using this for demonstration. I do this at the ironing board, and you can roll your edge right to where that seam is because you've done that understitching. And then I put a pin right in through the ironing board, and I go all the way around my garment. This facing is not hard. It just takes some time to execute beautifully. Now you can see that that is really pretty and flat, and I hit it with the steamer, and then while it's on the ironing board and kind of cooling down a little bit, I go ahead and tuck my pins in because I know this is nice and flat. And what that looks like when it's finished is this. So this side's done. I've completely pinned and pressed this whole side. And before I go and hand stitch that, I want to check and make sure I'm happy with the way the outside looks. This looks great. It's flat, it's beautiful, but the reason it's flat and beautiful is because we pressed it, we clipped it, we pressed it, we understitched it, we pinned it. You just take your time and it will work beautifully. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go in, because my seam is way down there. I have quite a bit of extra. I'm going to trim off some of this and fold it in and hand stitch it so it is even with the seam allowance. So you don't see the stitches from the front. I'm going to hand stitch it into my seam allowance there. And I'm going to go around and do the whole thing. That's going to take some time. The Patriots have their last game of the season today, so I'm going to watch them get clobbered and stitch that down by hand all the way around for a beautiful finish. Now, the pattern recommends going ahead and stitching it in the ditch after you do that, which is to run a stitch here in this seam between the blouse and the front band. I don't think I'm going to do that. I think that brings the look down, especially since I'm going to be wearing it open. You'll see the ridge on the inside if it's not like perfectly meticulous, and for me it's not worth the effort. So the next thing we're going to turn our attention to is the collar. We're going to start with the collar band, and we're going to start with the interfaced piece, and you want to fold it in half and find the center. So I'm just going to put a little pin in the center mark because that's going to line up with the center back. And again, we have a concave and a convex seam coming together. But what we want it to look like when it's finished is we want this collar band sewed on to the top of our neck edge this way. So you want this curved edge away. This really nice curved edge, it's going to be away from the short edge. So we're going to sew these right sides together. This does require a little bit of fitting. And then also you want to make sure that you have your seam allowance over the edge. So this is the edge of my facing. See it here? It's the edge of my facing. I want to make sure that I have 5/8 of an inch seam allowance because I'm going to sew the other band to this band. All right, we have a second band, so I'm going to sew the other collar band eventually to that band. You want to make sure that the dress, the blouse part, is down towards the feed dogs and the band is up top, because you have to kind of ease that in a little bit. And this is where, if you didn't do the stay stitching, you are going to be in trouble, because you don't want that neck band to stretch out. But you do need quite a few pins. And we're going to go ahead and sew this seam. While I'm sewing that seam, I'm also going to sew my collar together, since I'm going to the machine. And I'm going to sew the collar right sides together. I'm going to sew down each side and off, and across the bottom and off. And you can see on my corners, I went across. Now this hasn't been pressed. You want to make sure that you press it the way you sew it, press it flat, and then I would probably trim the edges. I'm going to take them to the serger and serge off the edges. So we have our beautiful neck band sewn on. You want to make sure before you do anything that you don't have any pleats in the back here on your shirt. I went through and checked mine before I overlocked the edge and made sure that there were no pleats. I did have one, I had to take it out, and then you just take a little bit out and restitch it. You can always baste it. So then we're gonna press this flat, trim it, we're gonna trim it. I did it with the overlocker, you can do it with the overlocker or scissors. And then you're gonna cut to, but not through, the seam allowance. Make sure that you're not cutting the blouse underneath all the way around, because you want this to curve nicely. And what these little snips do is it gives the fabric somewhere to go. I'm like every inch and a half. You'll be able to tell when you turn it up if they're close enough. So depending on how ravelly your fabric is, you need to make sure that you've done something to the neck edge. But yeah, once it's pressed, and you want to press the seam allowance towards the facing, you'll get a really nice finish there. It'll be nice and flat all the way around. So that takes care of that. Then we go back to our collar. After I sewed it together and overlocked it, I understitched the seam allowance to the facing, which is this uninterfaced piece, as best you can. You're not going to get right into the corner. You can only go so far with your machine. Then you're going to turn it inside right, and we're going to look at these corners. You turn one side down, turn the other side down. You get your thumb and your forefinger, and you kind of pinch that really pretty corner. So your corner's already pretty, so when you turn it through, it should still be pretty. I'm pretty happy with that. So you want to make sure that your corner, your collar, you're going to go back and press this so the understitching is on one side, nice and neat. And you want to make sure that it's balanced, because now is the time to check it. After you press it, make sure that these ends are the same. One isn't longer or shorter than the other. And then just after it's all pressed and everything, you want to baste these edges together, because it'll just be easier to work with one piece of fabric instead of having these two when you have to sew them around. All right, so I clipped and pressed my neckband. This is a ham. These are great for any kind of curved surface. So to get a good press on this, I pressed it flat, and then I pressed the seam allowance from this side. I pressed it towards the collar band. Then I went over with my pressing ham and made a nice press on this rounded part. So it gives me a really good curve. So this is a great tool to have. It's not very expensive, and I use it all the time. Any kind of curved seam or a sleeve cap, cuffs sometimes. This is, and if you have to train a collar, which we will probably do for this, this is a really good tool for that. So this, my neck, my collar band is on. I want to do a couple of things before I sew my collar to my collar band. I want to make sure that my collar band is the same. Now, my fabric is super slippery, so one piece was a little bit bigger than the other. You want to trim them so they're the same. It happens. Stuff moves around, but you don't want one collar piece to be this big, right, and the other collar piece down here, because then your collar isn't going to come out right. So once I've done that, I want to find the center of my collar band, and we'll set that aside for now. Now my collar, because they're both the same size. On a really couture pattern, you'll have a collar facing and a collar, you'll have two different pattern pieces. On this pattern, they're the same size. So once you put this understitching here and you roll the fabric to the facing, right, it gives you a beautiful edge. That is a given. But it also sucks up some of the fabric from the front. So one piece is going to be shorter than the other. And you can see, if you look at it, where I didn't understitch, my seam is right on this, my pressing is right on the seam edge here. But where I did understitch, that's where my collar is a little bit shorter. So that's okay, because I'm just going to use the longer seam. We have a 5/8 inch seam allowance, but I just want to make you aware. And then I went ahead and basted these, because this is the edge that's critical. I want to make sure that this edge is right and sharp and looks good. This I'm not so worried about, because eventually it's going to get trimmed away. Okay? And again, with your collar, you want to match them up, make sure your points are good, you're happy with the way it looks, they're the same size. One isn't, you know, that much longer than the other, then you're going to have problems later on down the road. So this is key, and then we're going to put a pin in the center of our collar. So here's our collar band. We've marked the center. Here's our collar. We've marked the center. I have the piece, the facing piece that has the understitching down. We're going to place it down towards the shirt, because when we wear this shirt, once we put the other collar band on, the collar is going to go like this. So we want the right side of the collar facing up and the shirt facing up. We're going to match these center marks in the back. This way I know that my collar is balanced from left to right. That's really key. And then on each end, we're going to pin the edge of the collar so it is within the seam allowance. So it leaves that seam allowance for this piece here, because we're going to sew the collar band, the second collar band on, and to encase all of this seam. So again, you have a curvy seam here. You want to take your time, pin it, because one is bigger than the other. So we want to take our time, pin it, have the collar band towards the feed dogs. And then the other thing that we do is just baste it. We're just going to baste it on. I would baste it at, if you're using a 5/8 inch seam allowance, I would baste it at a 1/2 inch, because you're going to go back in and seam over it with the other piece of the collar band. All right, here we go. We've sewed on the collar band. There's a little bit of tension. You can see the waffling here. I did baste it. So that's definitely going to gather up the fabric a little bit more. And what I want to do now is I want to apply the other collar band. So I finished the lower edge. I didn't press it, because I like to do that when I'm actually sewing my hand sewing my pieces together. And I made sure that these edges matched. I'm going to find the center back of my collar band facing, and the center back of my collar again, and then pin the right side of the facing over the collar and the collar band. So I start with this center back seam. And then when you get to the edges here, we're going to pin around this curve and fold up the facing piece, because we're going to go back and hand sew that in. So we're going to stitch around this curve all the way around. Make sure you don't catch the collar in there. All right, so stitch around the curve and all the way down and around the curve on the other side. And you want to fold this facing piece, you want to fold it up so you have a nice finished edge here. Oh, right here. All right, so when you fold it up, these meet. Be very careful, cognizant of these coming together and lining up with your banding. The collar is done. It's like one of the scariest things in the whole process of making a blouse, if you haven't done it before, is putting a collar on. So once I put that second band on, I made sure I pressed it really well, and then I hand stitched it down. You want the pattern calls to top stitch it or machine stitch it in, and you can certainly do that. But consider this, when this collar flops open, you're going to see this, and you want this to look really, really pretty. So the last thing that we want to do with our collar is to train it. And this is our trusty little ham here, and it makes a really nice place to train your collar. And if you have buttons, if you have a button down, then you'd want to button it because that's the way you'd want your collar to train. But I can pin this, put pins right into this ham, and I'm going to go around and make sure that the collar is exactly the way I like it. You can put pins into the collar if you're afraid it's going to move around or if it's giving you angst. I wouldn't put it into the collar itself, but you can put it into the back piece and pin it down. And then you want to take it to your ironing board and steam it a lot. If you don't have a steamer, get a damp cloth and put that on and iron it. You want to get some steam into this and then let it dry all by itself. So usually it's the last thing I do at night before I go upstairs. If I'm going to train a collar, I steam it and leave it on my ironing board until the next morning. And then when I come down the next morning, my collar is beautiful and ready to go. So we're going to take care of that. And while you can do that at the end, obviously, I just usually do it at the end of the day when my collar is finished. We're on the very tail end here. We're going to do the sleeves. Now, a couple of things about this sleeve. You always want to remember that the 2 notches in the sleeve pattern typically represents the back of the sleeve. And you can see that this sleeve is not symmetrical. So it's really important to make sure that the back goes to the back of your garment. Additionally, it has a cuff, and you don't want the cuff on the wrong side of the sleeve, right? So you need to make sure that the cuff goes to the back of the garment. So the first thing we're going to attack is this slit for the cuff. So we're going to take our piece and mark this cutting line, stitching and cutting line. It's definitely the stitching line on here. I chalked mine with white chalk so I could see it on my tissue. I mean on my blouse. You can see the chalk there. And I'm going to cut, I know this is like really awful. I'm going to cut between those stitching lines. So I took it to the machine. I used a narrow stitch, about a 2.4 on my machine, and I'm going to cut that open. Zoinks, right? Zoinks. Then we're going to take our little continuous lap, which is piece 8. It's just a little rectangle, and fold over 1/4 inch. So we have that finished and nicely pressed. Now we're going, this is the tricky part. We're going to open up our sleeve so this cut that we just made is straight, because we want to sew this lap onto this cut. And we're going to sew the right side of the lap, the unpressed edge, to the wrong side of the sleeve. And I know this seems counterintuitive, but this is the way it's going to go. So we're going to pin it. And I like to have the sleeve up because I still have that chalk line there, especially if your thread matches really well. And in this case, it's super dark, right? So I can go by the chalk line when I sew it. Gives me some guidance. And this takes a little patience, but you're going to pin this all the way across. So you want to keep the lap straight and pin to the apex of the cut there. And then you have to open the other side up. So that means you have to kind of pull your fabric away. We're going to open this side up and pin this down. And when we stitch this, so we're going to pin it all the way down the other side. When we stitch this, we want to stitch it right along that stitching line that we already stitched. And you can see how close you get to the edge. It's very close. You get almost right to the point there. Just make sure you catch the fabric. So now you have this thing that looks really weird, but we're gonna wrap it over around the front. So we want to take this folded edge and bring it to the seam line that we just stitched. Making sure that the seam, it's encasing the seam. Basically, we're finishing off the seam. So you can bring it a little past that seam, right? You know, the goal is to make sure that the lap is the same all the way around, like the same width. You don't want one end of the lap being super skinny and the other end of the lap being super wide. You want them to be the same all the way around. So I super carefully stitched that all the way around, and it needs a press, but what you end up with is this little thing that looks like this on your sleeve, right? Because this is going to be where the cuff opens up on your sleeve. All right, so we're gonna do that to both sleeves, and then the next thing we need to tackle are the pleats that are on the sleeve. So down here, we have 2 pleats, and they want you to take this line and move it to this line, and then this line and move it to this line. So let's see. I'm going to lay my pattern piece back out over my tissue and mark where my pleats are going to go. All right. So I have a pleat here, pleat line here. All right, so I just marked where my pleat lines are. You want to make sure that this is lined up correctly. So for the other piece, I'll use the reverse side of the tissue because you want the pleats to go towards the back of the sleeve. I'm just going to turn this a little bit. I'm going to take this first pin and move it to the second pin because that's the direction my pleat is going in. I'm going to pin that down. Same thing with my second pleat. I'm going to take the first pin, move it to the second pin. You want to make sure that the edges of your sleeve stay straight. Like you don't want something going wonky off to the side. All right, so I added a couple of pins. I'm just going to baste across that so it stays in place. Okay, we have our pleats in, we have our side piece in, and the next step is to sew up the sleeve right sides together. So we're gonna go ahead, that's pretty simple, and do that, and when we come back, we will put the, okay. We sewed up our sides, our sleeve seam, right, the back seam of our sleeve. You wanna give your little tab slit a good press, rolled it to the inside, right? Make sure everything is nice and pressed because we're gonna sew it to the cuff. Now, I happen to have a one-way design, so I need to make sure that this is the part that gets attached to the lower part of my sleeve, right? Because I want my cats all to be facing the same way. All right, so I wanna make sure that I leave a 5/8 inch seam allowance because we're gonna sew these up the sides when I attach it to my sleeve. So we're going to start, this is how it's going to attach, right? So I'm gonna flip this over, and with my band folded in, I'm going to attach my cuff. And I wanna pin it from the sleeve side because I wanna see what's going on. I have pleats down here, I have that little band on each side that needs to get folded in. I wanna make sure that everything is nice and smooth and I don't get any rumples. That my pleats are nice. The other thing that I did was I finished the other edge of my cuff and then pressed it under 1/4 inch. So once I have this pinned nicely all the way around and I have my seam allowance hanging out on the edges of my sleeve, I'm going to stitch that. I stitched it, I overlocked it, you could edge stitch it, and then I pressed, so you can see I have this really nice sleeve and my pleats are good, they're not rumpled. Before I go any further, I want to make sure that that's all set. Then the next thing I'm going to do is fold my sleeve onto itself, my cuff, sorry, onto itself and match up these sides. And you want to make sure that you really get a good juncture here. Clips won't do it. You need pins, and sometimes you even need to stitch it by hand if your machine's balking at you. But you want to make sure that you get a really nice finish there right at that juncture. So I'm going to sew down, straight down on each side, and then we'll come back and turn the cuff. All right, so here's my little seam. All right, we'll see how we did. This edge is folded in. I'm going to just fold this corner in and turn my cuff. Look at that nice little corner, right? You want to make sure you have a good corner. I'm going to turn this to the inside. Takes a little fiddling. I got a little too close there to the edge, so I'll just unpick that. Let's see how this side did. Try again. Again, we have a nice little corner. This is much better. You can see that I have a really nice edge there where my cuff comes into my sleeve. And then you just go back and hand stitch your cuff down to the seam allowance. I know there's a lot of hand stitching in this project, but this is really the end of it, except for the button. Hand sewn in there, and then you have this nice edge going down the opening of your cuff. Give it a good press, and then you're going to put in a button hole and a button. And one of the things, a trick about opening up buttonholes so you don't rip through them. I never use my seam ripper. People used to use that all the time, but you put a pin on each end of the buttonhole, and then that way you can't cut through that. Fold it in half. I like to use these because they have that little edge. The duckbill has that little edge. Clip it, and I can stick that little edge of my duckbill in there and clip to the pin, but I won't clip past the pin because it'll hurt my scissors and it won't help. And then I have this button. Now I was fortunate enough, and you're gonna look at this button, you're gonna say, oh, is that navy? Is that black? I think it might be navy. I'm okay with that. I'm fortunate enough to have the buttons from my mom and my grandmother and my mother-in-law, and I love using vintage buttons, and I like the way that this gold bar on this kind of reflects the angle of the cat eyes. So I'm gonna use a button on each one of the cuffs. I have 2 of those, and then I tried it on. The pattern has buttons going all the way down the front, and I don't ever see myself buttoning it all the way down. So I'm not gonna put any buttons on it on the full length. I am gonna put one because I have this one. I have one of these, and I think it will be really nice right up here at the top. This fabric that I have is so soft and so light that all the buttons on that will drag one side down. It'll be heavier than the other. So I'm going to put just this one button at the top because that's the trend right now, to button the top button and leave the rest unbuttoned anyway. So I'm just going to add that one. And then I just want to show you my collar. I trained it. I put it on the ham and pressed it, and it just lies so beautifully. I just left it overnight. I steamed it and left it overnight, and I have a gorgeous collar. So that's the cuffs. The cuffs are done. The last thing that we need to do is to insert the sleeve. And I like to lay my garments out, you know this, if you know me, right side up the way they're gonna go. And then I put pins in my sleeve on the back side. So I know that that is the back of my sleeve when I line it up to my front. So I know it's gonna go on this way. That's super important. And then the other mark that you want is the top of this pattern piece, this dot right here at the top of the pattern piece, because that mark, that dot matches up with your shoulder seam. Now, even though this is a set-in sleeve, it doesn't need to have gathering. I already put the other one in and it went in beautifully. So you're gonna match up that dot with your shoulder seam. Now I want these to go right sides together, and I want to pin it from the shirt side. So I'm going to flip my shirt over and grab that pin and mark it to the shoulder seam. This fabric is so delicate. It's gorgeous, but it's fly away and delicate. So then what I like to do is match up the underarm seams. And then I pin, you know, a couple inches this way up to where the notch is, because that's 1-to-1 in general for a sleeve. And then I go to the other side and pin that other side, and then just pin along here to fit all of this in, and it fits in beautifully. I've sewn this one already. I haven't pressed it yet, but you can see what a really nice sleeve that is. It went in really well. And that's it. This blouse is done. I'm going to put a buttonhole up at the top. If you want to put buttons along the side, then you just open it up, start with a button up here, place your buttons, space them down the way you like them. If you're going to button it, make sure that you put a button, a critical button, at the apex of the bust line, because that's where it's going to gap. If it's a little snug or if you move, that's where the gapping is going to occur. So start there. If this is where my critical button is, I'm going to start here, and then I'm going to space my buttons out accordingly. I'll probably put a button here, then figure out this space, and then use that space all the way down the line. I know there's a button gauge in the pattern, but that doesn't take into account your body, you know, how long of a midriff you have, where that critical button needs to go. That's really important. That's what makes this garment customizable. When you're making blouses or jackets or anything that you want to stay closed, that critical button needs to be right on the bust line, and you go from there. And you'll be much happier with the way that your clothes fit. So yeah, that's a wrap. Let's see how she looks.